Welcome back to the show. Joining us tonight is Andrew Holder from TDA Interiors and Rob Morris from Space Consulting. So if you've got a question about commercial property and want their expert advice, the number to call is 1300 30 34 35. Now, before the break, we were talking all about trying to get the fit out. So I guess the next question is what kind of terms do you search on to find businesses such as yourself that can help with fit outs?
Well, the internet's obviously a good portal for that. You know, searching through office interior design or office fit out would be a good starting point. But it's a very well-connected industry, so you'll probably find is if you're gaining property advice through an agent like Rob or talking to any real estate advisor, everyone talks to each other in our industry, so some good referrals could be made.
And how do you find the differences between the various companies? Obviously, if you haven't been down that path before, it's a bit like choosing a builder.
Yeah.
You think you're going to be shocked by all of them. How do you find the good ones from the bad ones?
Well, I mean, there are a number of different people you can go to, as we mentioned earlier. There are design-only companies, there are project management-only companies, and there are companies that combine both functions into one. And again, it depends really on the scale of the project. If it's, you know, as I said earlier, if it's under 3,000 square metres, 300 people in an office, then typically a company that can find the right design partner and construction manage the project for you would be a good solution.
So certainly if you're a beginner out there, then maybe a one-stop shop that can look after the whole lot's probably not a bad idea.
Certainly for small to medium-sized businesses, that's a good solution. Otherwise, you're stooped in fees from lots of different parties.
Yeah. And is it the kind of thing that you can go out to tender as well and go off to 5 companies and say, look, this is what I'm trying to do, and they all pitch for your business? Yeah,
you've got to make sure that the brief that you're giving those companies is the same, so you're getting the same sort of response from them. But that is one solution. The preference, though, really is that, I mean, the tendered route is, you know, it's quite, they call it hard dollar tendering because it is hard. It's hard for the client and it's hard for the builder as well. So the preference is that you get involved earlier with somebody, you know, gain consultative advice, gain trust with somebody, so you feel like you're getting a good solution.
Yeah. And with typically a lot of the advisors, are they charging on like a project basis or by the hour? Are there any better ways of trying to control costs?
Well, the tendered route certainly gives you I guess the market value of what's going on in the marketplace in terms of tendering is going out to the market and finding the cheapest price. So that gives you the sort of strongest indicator. But hidden beneath that, you might be dealing with a contractor that doesn't have any money in their bank and that might go bust on you. So you've got to consider those sort of factors as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, coming back to the lease, then when you've done all these fit-outs, what actually happens at the end? Do you have to deconstruct everything, or can you say, look, can I leave it all there because the next tenant will be easier to let it all out again?
Yeah, look, I mean, the landlords have got you there as well, I have to say, but again, there are strategies to use. The standard lease will have a make-good provision, so whatever fit-out is generally there, the landlord will try and get the tenant to take all of that fit-out out at the end of the lease, make good the premises, which is something that Andrew's company would do, and actually leave the space ready for a new tenant to come in. What happens in reality is that make good process is very often a negotiation. It's down to how well the make good clause has been structured in the lease. Some are very good, some aren't very good, and it's also down to the landlord you're dealing with. He may be quite happy for you to negotiate a cash settlement, which is often a lot less stressful. It's a lot easier for all sides to do, where both sides get an estimate of the works, and then you agree on a sum of money. And very often, if that fit out is actually in good condition, it can then provide an inducement to an incoming tenant at a lesser cost. So there's ways around it, but it is a bit of a sting in the tail to leases, you know, and tenants need to sort of be mindful of it and negotiate as from their side probably a minimal fit out as possible. From the landlord's side, they're going to try and get everything thrown in.
And when landlords are actually signing up leases, how much investigation do they do on their prospective tenant? Like, obviously a lot of small businesses are $2 companies. Yeah. Can they walk away, or are there generally always personal guarantees? Because especially if the fit-out removal is going to be, say, 100 grand or 50 grand or whatever the number is, yeah, I'm sure they want some kind of guarantee, don't they? Yeah, the leases will generally have a bank guarantee requirement. Standard is about 6 months. For shorter-term leases, it may be down to 3. But and so that means you've got to physically put the money in deposit in an account, is that right?
Correct, that's right. You put it in deposit, so if anything goes wrong during the lease, if you run away from your commitments, or at the end of the lease if you don't make good, or if there's some outgoing liabilities, the landlord can call on those funds. So you know, for a smallish company that can be quite a large sum of money. For a bigger company it's not so bad, but it's you know, it's a substantial sum nonetheless.
Yeah. And how important is it to actually choose your office location? So, I mean, both of you run your own businesses. How much do people get judged based on if their property's in the right street or the right building?
Look, I think they do. There's certain industries that like to be in the right location, like law firms like to be in the CBDs of major cities. Media companies like to be in the fringe because they're a bit more trendier and the buildings are a bit more interesting. So it does matter. But it also matters, I mean, less from a client perspective, but from an employee perspective. You know, sometimes staff retention and attraction is a key factor in where businesses are located. You know, if they're easy to get to in the city, if they're train rides or ferry rides, you're going to attract good staff. If you're in a cool building, you know, in a great location, lots of cafes, if it's that kind of industry, you're going to attract that kind of staff. So most companies try to bring that kind of thinking into their whole strategy, and often get feedback from staff. You know, it can be a very big move for some companies, and you know, often by setting up committees internally, they get feedback and where do people want to be, and that way they're hopefully involving staff and not going to lose staff when they actually relocate.
Yeah, it's a thing I hadn't really thought of. So how involved do the staff typically get, and do the management involve the staff in those kind of decisions, say with the internal fit out?
I guess it depends on the democracy or autocracy in the company overall, but yeah, I mean, we see a lot of companies that get very collaborative in the way they approach those things, and they'll consult with the staff, and there's others that, you know, they want to be on the North Shore because that's where the boss lives, so you've got those sort of dynamics to work with. But, you know, as a business owner, 75% of our overheads are people, and I think 5 or 6% are premises. So when you look at you know, as a business grows, the overall, you know, the cost ratio of your premises against your people, you know, makes being in the right location quite important.
Yeah, because certainly, say, looking around Sydney, things like Macquarie Bank, or like you look at, everyone knows the Apples and the Googles, everyone wants to kind of work there. Some of them are pretty funky businesses, and they're doing some pretty amazing things these days, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of money being spent out there still, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of, I guess, the other things in, I guess, buildings, what are some of the other important things? Like, I mean, you guys mentioned before things like kind of building security, getting access. What are some of those things, and why are they issues?
Well, I mean, within the lease terms, there'll be the security issues on the building would be presented to the tenant. So, you know, they'd typically be, you know, the building gets closed at 6 o'clock, the lifts get locked off, the air conditioning gets shut off. So, you know, if you've got a comms room as an example, or a server room that's mission critical and it's linked to Europe or whatever, and the air conditioning's being switched off, you'd want to know about that, and you'd want to deal with that as part of your contingency plan with your fit out. So those sort of issues are quite important.
Right, okay.
And there's sort of green issues now in the market. I mean, you know, companies are trying to be perceived as green, and there's a number of buildings in the CBD that are trying to get their rating up and be seen at sort of the top end, and always competing. So I think, you know, not only is location important and budget important to some companies, but also how green is it, how healthy is it going to be to the environment, and that I think is probably going to be more of an issue going forward.
Because who actually rates it to say that it comes up to a certain standard within green, do you know?
Well, there's a couple of agencies in Australia now that do that, and there's a lot of consultants that provide the advice to give the rating. What we've seen over the last few years is that, you know, with less money to spend on fit-outs with the GFC period, the world's almost become greener because people have been having to reuse things. You know, typically 2 or 3 years ago, you'd go into an office and, you know, a Macquarie Bank would have gone in there and stripped out the floor and put brand new furniture in and brand new lighting and, you know, brand new everything, and spent a hell of a lot of money. 2 years on, a floor with that sort of infrastructure would maybe be reused. So almost green by default we've become.
Right. And with the green buildings, is a lot of that just the, I guess, the publicly listed companies that are trying to do the right thing, and maybe they're doing it genuinely? Do the smaller companies kind of worry about that stuff as much?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things to talk about there. There's a mandatory disclosure situation in Sydney, Melbourne, and all the major CBDs where major building landlords have to disclose the star rating of their building, and that comes up in 2012. But the real issue, there's two real green star factors. One is what the building's doing, which is what the landlord's providing, and the other is what the tenant's doing to the space, and they're two different things.
Right, okay. What about in terms of things like utilities? Does that make quite a big difference across buildings and the way you actually fit things out?
Utility costs, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, energy efficiency is a big part of the Green Star rating that exists. So, you know, landlord buildings that have been designed to a Green Star rating, generally the utilities bills will be a hell of a lot lower. But most stock is obviously still quite old, so, and inefficient.
I was going to say there's still a bit of a discrepancy between those big landlords that have gone green, that have invested a lot of money, are still asking a premium for those buildings, and there's still a gap between the tenant's willingness to actually make that jump over and above what they'd normally pay for rent to be in a green building. So, you know, that's something that the market will work out. But you know, it's an issue of perception. It's also how much people are willing to pay for being green. And obviously over the last 12 months things have been incredibly tight, so probably not very much. But going forward, it's going to be. I think the gap's going to close. Yeah.
And if you've got people out there looking for, say, space at the moment, where are maybe some of the best areas or the best opportunities to get the most negotiation? Is it in the older buildings? Is it kind of further out of town, or is it just depend on that city?
Look, it depends on the city. I mean, look, generally, if I was going to draw a sort of rule of thumb, the bigger landlords and the institutional landlords normally have the funds available on hand to put in the bigger incentives. And obviously they need to fill their buildings. They can throw a lot more assets and resources at doing so. So in the major CBD buildings, they're probably going to be on the top in terms of the incentive pile. When you get out to the fringes, with the smaller landlords, what tends to happen is they reduce the rental that they're actually asking, and often don't offer anywhere as near as the market incentive, but they get away with it because they say, well, we've reduced the rent and we haven't got the funds. So those scenarios are still workable because the overall budget is the overall budget, and if the rent's lower, you know, maybe they can put a little bit more capital into fit out. So,
so typically for the mum and dad investors that have maybe just got $1 million property or something, they can't afford to have 12 months without any rent because obviously they've still got to pay a mortgage.
Yep.
So as long as they've got something coming in, they're more likely to do it.
Yeah, I think so. I think in the fringe location, you need to meet the market basically, and it is still a very competitive market, and I'd say it's still a tenant's market. So those landlords, even the mum and dad investors, can't sit tight on empty properties for months on end. They've got to offer a good deal, try and keep the term of the lease to as long as possible, obviously for them, and work with the tenant. I think that's key, not against the tenant, to make sure that each side is happy in the negotiation.
I remember a few years ago going to a speech of one of the biggest mortgage providers in Australia, and the entrepreneur who was running it was saying when he started his business he had no money to rent office space and the rest of it, and if anything you make yourself bigger and hire even more space, because then exactly you can get like a year's free. So he couldn't afford to pay the rent, but he can actually afford to take on a building. That's right. And ideally make the bet that in a year's time the business is up and running, and then you're actually kind of running from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's certainly opportunities out there pretty much all the time.
I think even with a short-term lease, always ask. You know, I think that's obviously an advisor's job to do it for you, but even on a small lease, short-term, there's always something to be gained by negotiating.
And if you haven't got a poker face, then hire an expert and get them to ask the question instead. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a minute, so don't go away.